You know, when we think about the 2008 financial crisis, the story usually goes something like this. Greedy bankers, crazy derivatives, and a housing market that went off the rails. But what if that's only half the story? In this explainer, we're going to dig into Raghuram Rajan's incredible book, Fault Lines, to uncover the deeper, hidden fractures in the global economy, cracks that were decades in the making and, as he argues, led directly to the meltdown.
Just imagine this for a second. It's 2005. 3 full years before Lehman Brothers collapses and the world economy teeters on the brink. You've got all the world's top financial minds gathered in one room, patting themselves on the back, and one economist, Raghuram Rajan, gets up and warns them that the whole system is becoming dangerously unstable. And what happens? He's not celebrated. He's practically attacked. That quote right there, it perfectly captures the hostility he faced for just daring to spoil the party.
So, let's go back to that moment. The setting was the Jackson Hole Economic Conference. This is a huge deal, an annual gathering of the most powerful central bankers on the planet. And in 2005, the mood was, well, it was more than just optimistic, it was triumphant.
The whole event was basically a big send-off for the legendary Fed chairman Alan Greenspan, who was seen as the maestro of the global economy. But right in the middle of all this celebration, Rajan presented a paper. And he basically argued that all this amazing financial innovation everyone was cheering for had actually made the entire system way, way riskier. He said bankers were incentivized to take on these hidden tail risks, these long-shot bets that probably wouldn't fail, but if they did, it would be absolutely catastrophic. And the reaction? People were dismissive. Some were even openly angry.
So that brings us to the key question of this whole explainer. What on earth did he see that so many of the smartest people in the room were completely ignoring? His warning, it turns out, wasn't just about complex finance. It was about deep, hidden fractures running through our societies and the global economy. These are what he calls the fault lines.
And believe it or not, the first, and maybe the most important fault line wasn't buried in some Wall Street bank's balance sheet. Nope, it was a deep, growing crack running right through the heart of the American economy itself, rising income inequality.
Here's the problem in a nutshell. Starting back in the 1980s, technology and globalization created this thing economists call the college premium. Basically, the wage gap between someone with a college degree and someone with just a high school diploma grew into this massive chasm. This left a huge part of the American population feeling anxious and left behind, watching their incomes totally stagnate for decades.
And this anxiety got supercharged by a new, really worrying trend, the jobless recovery. See, before 1991, jobs would usually bounce back within about 8 months after a recession. But after the recessions in 91 and 01, it started taking years for jobs to come back. This, as you can imagine, created enormous pressure on politicians from both parties to do something to help an economically stressed-out population.
So what was the political fix for this deep-seated problem? Well, this is where things get really dangerous. Instead of doing the hard, long-term work of improving education and job skills, the much easier political answer was what Rajan brilliantly calls, let them eat credit. Politicians on both sides of the aisle pushed policies that made credit, especially for buying a house, incredibly easy to get. It was the perfect political band-aid to cover up a much deeper economic wound.
Okay, so while all of this is brewing inside the US, a second, massive fault line was developing on the other side of the world, and it was about to provide the fuel for America's credit-fueled fire.
You can think of the world economy as running on 2 totally different operating systems. On one side, you had countries like the US and the UK that were focused on their own consumers. But on the other side, you had export powerhouses like Germany, Japan, and later on China. Their whole economic model was built to produce, and sell to the rest of the world. And they did it by deliberately holding down spending at home, keeping wages low and savings high so their goods would be cheap for everyone else to buy.
So what happens when you have entire countries built to sell, not to buy? Well, you get a gigantic global flood of extra cash, trillions of dollars, sloshing around the system looking for a safe place to go. And where did it all end up? It poured into the United States, so much so that by 2006, the US was soaking up a staggering 70% of the entire world's excess capital. This was the cheap money that made America's credit boom possible.
So now we have the 2 main pieces of the puzzle, right? At home, you have intense political pressure to hand out easy credit, and from abroad, you have a massive flood of cheap money looking for a home. And you can probably guess what happened next. When these 2 fault lines finally collided, the result was explosive.
Here's how this crazy feedback loop worked. Step 1. Growing inequality in the U.S. creates a lot of economic anxiety and political pressure. Step 2. Politicians respond not with tough reforms, but with the easy fix of expanding credit, especially for housing. Step 3. That flood of money from countries like China provides the fuel, keeping interest rates on the floor. And step 4. This toxic combination created one of the biggest, most unsustainable housing bubbles in history. Period.
What you end up with is this incredibly shaky, codependent relationship on a global scale. Exporting nations like China needed American consumers to keep buying all their stuff. And the American political system needed that cheap money from China to keep its own citizens happy with easy credit. The entire global economy was balanced on a razor's edge.
So what's the big takeaway here? Rajan's point is that if you think the answer is just adding more banking regulations, you're totally missing the point. To actually prevent the next crisis, we have to go deeper and repair the underlying fault lines that made the system so fragile to begin with. So what does that actually mean? Well, here in the US, it means making serious investments in education to close that skills gap. It means strengthening the social safety net, things like healthcare and unemployment support, so people don't have to turn to debt when they hit a rough patch. And on the global side, it means pushing countries like China and Germany to rely less on exports and more on their own consumers. It requires a fundamental rebalancing of the whole world economy.
And this really gets to the heart of the argument. You simply can't achieve lasting financial stability if huge chunks of the population feel like they're being left behind. The financial system will always find a way to take advantage of the political pressure that's born from real economic pain.
And that leaves us with a final, pretty unsettling question for today. The very same fault lines that Rajan identified, deep inequality within countries and huge imbalances between them, they're still very much with us. In some ways, they're even wider. So the real question isn't just about what caused the last crisis. It's whether we've actually done anything to prepare ourselves for the next tremor.